They read my son's will in a room that smelled like lilies and lawyer's cologne, and when the attorney reached my name, my daughter-in-law actually smiled. I got a car. She got everything else, the house, the money, 41 years of my son's life, folded into paperwork that erased me in under a minute. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. I just took the keys. I had no idea that by nightfall my dead son would speak to me from the dashboard of that car and tell me the accident that killed him was no accident at all. I've buried men before. Young men, mostly boys, really, 19 and 20 years old, with their whole lives folded up neatly inside them like letters they never got to send home. I carried that weight for 30 years in the Army, and I told myself somewhere along the way that grief gets easier to carry the more of it you hold. That's a lie old soldiers tell themselves. I know that now, standing over my son's grave in a cemetery outside Boston, in a suit that used to fit me better before my shoulders started giving up on holding themselves square. Michael was 41, a doctor, orthopedic trauma, the kind of surgeon who put shattered people back together and sent them home walking. He had his mother's patience, and I'd like to think a little of my discipline. He used to call me every Sunday at 6 in the evening without fail, even during his residency when he was running on 4 hours of sleep and hospital coffee. 2 Sundays ago, that phone didn't ring. Instead, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. And a voice I didn't know told me my son's car had gone off Route 9 in the rain, and that it had been quick, that he wouldn't have felt much. People say that to soften it. I've said it myself to other fathers, other mothers, back when I was the one making the call. It never softens anything. It just gives you a smaller box to put the pain in. I did not cry at the funeral. Some people took that as coldness. Rebecca, my son's wife, glanced at me twice during the service, like she was waiting for me to break. Like my composure was some kind of insult to her performance of grief, which was loud and wet, and I noticed remarkably well lit for the cameras of the local news crew that had shown up to cover the tragic death of a beloved Boston surgeon. I did not blame her for crying. I blame myself a little for not being able to. A soldier learns to lock a door inside himself. Sometimes he forgets where he put the key. After the burial, we went back to the house, Michael's house, the one with the wide porch he built with his own hands one summer, just to prove to himself he still could, even with a surgeon's delicate fingers. Attorney Linda Hayes sat us down in the study with the will spread across the desk like a map to a country I'd never been invited into. She read through it in that flat, careful lawyer's voice. The investment accounts, the estate, the trust fund set up for my grandson Noah, the life insurance, several $1 million, all of it, every last cent to Rebecca. And to me, the old SUV, the one Michael drove every day to the hospital, the one with 200,000 miles on it and a crack in the windshield he never got around to fixing. Rebecca looked at me across that desk, and there was something in her face I'll never forget. Not grief, not even relief, just a kind of quiet, satisfied arithmetic, like she'd been waiting to see if I'd argue. I didn't. I'm 74 years old. I've seen what money does to families, watched it turn brothers into strangers over dinner tables. I wasn't going to fight my son's widow over dollars while his grave was still soft. At least you got something, she said, and there was a smile in it that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. I nodded once. I don't need much. By that afternoon, I understood exactly how much she meant that arithmetic. I went upstairs to gather a few of my things. I'd been staying in the guest room since the funeral arrangements began, and found my key no longer worked in the lock. She'd had it changed. Efficient. Quick. My son wasn't in the ground a full week, and already the locks on his life had been rekeyed against me. I didn't argue. I've faced worse enemies than a woman with a locksmith's number saved in her phone. I packed what fit into 2 duffel bags, some clothes, my old service flag folded into a tight triangle, the way you're taught never to forget a photograph of Michael as a boy holding a fish, nearly as long as his arm, and I walked out to that SUV in the driveway, key in hand, the September evening turning that particular gold color that makes even sad days look like paintings. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before I turned the key. The leather still smelled like him, like the coffee he drank too much of. Like the hospital, faintly, like the cologne I bought him for Christmas the year before. I put my hands on the wheel and I let myself feel for just a moment how empty that car was without my son's voice filling it. Then the engine caught and the dashboard screen lit up on its own. A recording began to play. His voice, Michael's voice, steady, urgent, like he was speaking through a door that was closing behind him. "Dad, if you're hearing this, follow the GPS. Don't tell Rebecca. My hands went still on the wheel. The house behind me with its rekeyed locks and its lily smell still clinging to my suit suddenly felt very far away. The GPS screen flickered, and a route began to draw itself across the map, heading somewhere I had never been told about. Somewhere my son wanted me and only me to find. I sat there in the driveway for a long time after that recording ended, engine idling, my own breath sounding too loud in my ears. Michael's voice had that same steadiness he used with frightened patience. I'd heard him use it once years back when he called to walk me through what a torn rotator cuff meant after I fell off a ladder cleaning gutters I had no business cleaning at my age. Calm, certain. A voice built to make other people feel safe even when he himself was not. Don't tell Rebecca. 4 words that rearranged everything I thought I understood about my son's death. I looked up at the house, her house now I supposed, and saw a curtain shift in the front window. I didn't wait to find out if she was watching. I put the SUV in reverse and pulled out of that driveway, like a man being pulled by something greater than his own will, which I suppose in a way I was. The GPS took me north out past the suburbs, past the strip malls and the gas stations onto roads that got narrower and greener the further I drove until the trees closed in overhead, like the aisle of some old church. I recognized the direction before I recognized the destination, Lake Winnegan. We used to rent a cabin there every August when Michael was a boy. Cheap little place with a screen door that never quite closed right, and a dock that groaned under your feet like an old man complaining about his knees. His mother used to fry fish on a camp stove out on that dock, while Michael, 6, 7, 8 years old, sat with his bare feet in the water and a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. We hadn't been back there in over 30 years. I didn't even know the cabin still stood. It did. Weathered gray now instead of red, the paint long since surrendered to the lake weather, but it was there tucked back off the main road exactly where memory said it would be. The GPS route ended in the gravel lot beside it. I parked and sat there a moment, my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest before I got out. The evening had gone from gold to that deep blue that comes right before full dark, and the lake was dead still, the way it gets sometimes, like it's holding its breath along with you. I walked down to the dock, still groaning. God help me, still groaning exactly the way I remembered. And I stood there not entirely sure what I was looking for. A boy's ghost maybe, some sign. Then I saw it. Wedged under the third plank, from the end in the shadow where the dock met the water, a small metal box, waterproof, the kind you'd store important documents in during a flood. Someone had wired it to the underside of the dock recently. The wire was too clean, too new to have been there 30 years. My hands were not steady when I pulled it free. I want to say a soldier's hands don't shake, but that would be a lie, and I promised myself a long time ago I'd stop telling those. I sat down right there on the dock, my knees complaining the way the wood complained, and I opened the box. Inside, a leather-bound journal worn soft at the corners, like he'd carried it in his coat pocket for months. A small external hard drive, the kind you'd use to back up sensitive files. A single brass key unlabeled, and an envelope with my name written on it in Michael's handwriting, that same careful, slightly slanted script he'd had since medical school. The handwriting of a man who wrote 1,000 charts a year and never once let it turn to chicken scratch. I opened the envelope first. My hands were shaking harder now. Dad, it began. If this message ever reaches you, it means I couldn't tell you in person, and that means something happened to me that I couldn't stop. I need you to know before anything else my death, if you're reading this because of my death, was not an accident. I read that line 4 times. The lake in front of me had gone fully dark now, and somewhere out on the water, a loon called that long, lonely sound that always used to make Michael as a boy grab my sleeve and ask if it was crying. I kept reading. I've been afraid for months, Dad. I didn't want to worry you, and I didn't have proof, not real proof, not the kind that would hold up not until recently. There are things happening around Rebecca that I don't fully understand, yet people she's been meeting, money moving in ways that don't make sense for a household our size. I started keeping records. Everything's on the hard drive. I couldn't go to the police without more, and I was afraid if I said the wrong thing to the wrong person, it would put you and Noah in danger too. If something happens to me, go to James first. You can trust him. Don't trust anyone connected to Rebecca's business associates, not her lawyer, not the man she calls her financial advisor. I don't have all the names yet. I'm sorry I'm leaving you this instead of an explanation over dinner. I always thought I'd have more time to figure this out safely. Whatever happens, know that I love you and that everything I did trying to protect this family. Follow the money, Dad, and be careful. Please, for Noah's sake, be careful. Michael. I sat on that dock for a long time after I finished reading the journal and the hard drive heavy in my lap, the brass key cold against my palm. The lake had gone black and silent, mirror still, under a sky just starting to prick with stars. And I thought about my son sitting somewhere, maybe in this very spot writing this letter, with the particular fear of a man who suspects he's running out of time and doesn't know how much he has left. I had spent 30 years training to recognize threats, to read a room, to sense danger before it announced itself. I had missed every single sign in my own son's life. That failure sat in my chest like a stone as I gathered the box, climbed back up off that dock, and walked to the car with a single name repeating itself in my mind, like a compass needle finding true north. James Carter. It was time to call in an old debt between two old soldiers. James Carter and I go back further than either of us likes to admit out loud. We served 2 tours together before he left the Army for the police academy, and I stayed in for the long haul. He retired from the Boston PD 8 years ago as a detective, and these days he mostly fishes and complains about his knees, which puts him one complaint ahead of me, since mine haven't started yet. I called him from the gravel lot beside that cabin, my voice steadier than I felt, and told him I needed to see him. Not on the phone, in person. He met me at his kitchen table the next morning with 2 cups of black coffee and the particular stillness of a man who has learned over decades of hard news not to react until he has all the facts. I laid it out for him, the recording in the car, the box under the dock, the letter. He read Michael's words twice slowly, his jaw tightening on the second pass, in a way I recognized from 30 years of watching that same jaw tighten before he made a decision he wasn't going to walk back from. "Your boy suspected somebody was going to kill him," James said finally, "and he built himself a dead man's switch instead of going to the police. He said he didn't have proof yet. He said he was afraid of who he'd have to tell it to." James turned that over. "That's not paranoia talk, Daniel. That's a man who thought somebody inside the system might be compromised." He tapped the hard drive. "You opened this yet?" I hadn't. I didn't have the equipment, and honestly, some coward's part of me wasn't ready to see whatever was on it. James had a friend, a retired tech from the department's digital forensics unit, who owed him a favor and didn't ask questions he wasn't paid to ask. We drove the hard drive over that same afternoon. While the drive was being examined, James and I went to see Emily Foster. She'd been Michael's nurse for 6 years, one of the few people at that hospital who saw him not as the brilliant surgeon everyone praised in the break room, but as the tired, worried man underneath the white coat. We found her in the hospital cafeteria on her lunch break, and the moment I said Michael's name, her eyes filled up so fast I had to look away and give her a second. He wasn't himself the last few months. She told us, turning a paper coffee cup in slow circles on the table. Distracted, losing weight. I asked him once if everything was okay at home, and he just said, "Emily, if anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll trust my father. Whatever anybody says about him, whatever story gets told, trust my father." I felt that sentence land somewhere behind my ribs and stay there. "Did he say why?" James asked. Emily hesitated, glancing around the cafeteria, the way people do when they've decided mid-conversation that a thing might actually be dangerous to say out loud. "There was a black SUV, she said, finally quieter. "I saw it in the parking garage more than once, same one just sitting there. One night I was leaving late, and Michael walked me to my car, insisted on it, which wasn't like him. He was always the one running behind, and I saw him look at that SUV like he recognized it, like it scared him." She told us about the phone calls too. Michael stepping out of the nurse's station to take calls he never took in front of anyone, coming back tense, jaw tight, the same tell I'd seen in James not an hour before. And she told us something else, something that made the coffee in my stomach turn cold. Rebecca had been coming to the hospital more often in the last few months, and every visit ended the same way: Michael, in his office afterward, door closed. Voice raised just enough to carry through the walls, arguing about paperwork, transfer documents, signatures. Rebecca pushing, Michael resisting. He told me once, Emily said that she wanted him to sign something moving assets into a trust she controlled. He said he wasn't ready. He said something felt wrong about the timing. We pulled hospital parking garage footage. After that, James still had enough goodwill left with his old department to make a few calls. And there it was, plain as anything. A black SUV, no plates visible in any of the angles, present in that garage on 11 separate nights over 4 months. Always parked in the same shadowed corner. always gone before the day shift arrived. I sat in James's car afterward, watching that grainy footage loop on his laptop screen, and felt something I hadn't let myself feel since the day of the funeral. Not grief exactly. Rage, cold and very old, the kind I hadn't touched since my last deployment, the kind a man learns to leash because it's dangerous off the chain. My son had known. For months he had known something was closing in on him, and he had spent those months protecting a family that included a wife, slowly methodically working to strip him of everything, and a father he barely dared warn for fear of putting a target on my back too. Daniel! James's voice pulled me back. He was watching me with the same steady patience he'd shown at the kitchen table. We do this right. We don't go at Rebecca head-on, not yet, not until we know exactly what's on that drive and exactly who else is involved. If she's part of something bigger spooking her now, just makes them careful. You understand me? I understood him. Every instinct in me wanted to drive straight to that house and stand in the doorway until someone told me the truth. But I hadn't survived 30 years in uniform by charging into fire without a plan, and I wasn't about to start now, not with my grandson's safety hanging somewhere in the balance of whatever this turned out to be. Whatever it takes, I said. I want the truth. All of it. However long it takes to get there. James nodded once, closed the laptop, and reached for his phone to check on the hard drive. Then let's go find out what your son was really afraid of. The tech James trusted was a wiry, quiet man named Pete, who worked out of a converted garage full of servers that hummed like a hive of electronic bees. He'd cracked the encryption on Michael's hard drive by the time we arrived, and he greeted us with the careful, guarded expression of a man who'd seen something he wished he hadn't. You should sit down for this, he told me, and I remember thinking that a man my age has heard that sentence enough times to know it's never followed by good news. We sat in front of his monitors, 3 screens wide, and Pete began pulling up files. Michael had been methodical, more methodical than I ever gave him credit for, more methodical, frankly, than most investigators I'd worked alongside during my career. Folders organized by date, video files, audio recordings, scanned documents, spreadsheets, tracking numbers that meant nothing to me until Pete began walking us through them. The videos hit hardest. Michael had rigged a small camera in his own study at home. I don't know when, I don't know how he found the nerve to spy in his own house, and it had captured over several months a series of meetings Rebecca held there when she believed the house was empty. A heavy-set man in an expensive suit who Pete identified after some digging as a Boston businessman named Victor Reyes, someone with a name that turned up in 3 separate financial fraud investigations over the past decade, none of which had ever stuck. A lawyer neither James nor I recognized, sharp-suited and soft-spoken, who did most of the talking in hushed, careful sentences, and a third man older who Rebecca called only the broker, never by name. In the recordings, they spoke about insurance, about asset transfers, about timing, about how certain policies needed to mature, about pressure that needed to be applied before he changes his mind about the trust. At one point, Rebecca's voice, cool and businesslike, in a way that turned my stomach, said clearly, "He's already suspicious. We need to move before he does something stupid." I sat very still in that chair. Beside me, I heard James exhale slowly through his nose, the sound of a man forcing himself to stay calm for someone else's sake. Then Pete pulled up the file that changed everything. It was a set of maintenance records and photographs Michael had taken himself, time-stamped just 11 days before his death. Close-up shots of the SUV's brake lines, not the one I now drove, but a different vehicle. One registered to a colleague of Michael's, a fellow surgeon named Dr. Aaron Kessler. The brake lines showed clear signs of tampering, a deliberate professional cut, designed to fail gradually rather than immediately, the kind of sabotage meant to look, to any investigator not looking closely, exactly like normal wear. "Why is he photographing another man's car?" James asked, though I think by then we both already suspected the terrible shape of the answer. Pete pulled the last document, an email dated the day before the accident from Michael to himself, a habit I'd learned he'd developed for keeping a time-stamped record of his own fears. In it, he wrote that he and Aaron had swapped vehicles that week. Aaron's car was in the shop for an unrelated issue, and Michael had lent him the SUV temporarily while borrowing Aaron's sedan in return. Then at the last minute on the morning of the accident, they'd swapped back. Aaron needed his own car for a family emergency, and Michael, running late for a surgery, took the SUV without a second thought. I understood then with a clarity that felt like a physical blow exactly what my son had died discovering too late. The tampered brakes weren't meant for Michael's usual car. They were rigged into a vehicle that was for 1 week driven by someone else, and then through nothing but the ordinary chaos of two busy doctors trading favors, ended up back in my son's hands on exactly the wrong morning. Whoever had planned this had been targeting the car, not realizing or not caring which of the two men would be behind the wheel when it failed. My son hadn't been murdered by mistake. He'd been murdered by a plan careless enough, arrogant enough to not even bother confirming who was driving. "Do we know if Kessler's alive?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and far away in my own ears. James was already dialing. Aaron Kessler, it turned out, was alive and well and utterly unaware that a car meant to kill him had instead killed his colleague. When James finally reached him by phone that evening, explaining as gently as a retired detective knows how, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a grown man beginning quietly to fall apart. I didn't feel triumph learning the mechanism of my son's death. I felt something colder and heavier settle into my chest, the certainty that this had never been personal in the way grief wants it to be. Michael hadn't been killed because of who he was. He'd been killed because of what he'd started to see, and the people responsible hadn't cared enough to even get the details right. There was something almost more monstrous in that carelessness than in cruelty itself. That night, back at James's house, I sat with Michael's journal one more time, rereading his careful, worried handwriting by lamplight. In one of the last entries, dated maybe 3 weeks before his death, he'd written, "I keep telling myself I'm being paranoid. But Dad always said the moment you start hoping you're wrong is usually the moment you already know you're right." I hadn't remembered saying that to him, but it sounded like me, like something I might have told a much younger Michael, some lesson passed down from a career built on trusting instinct over comfort. My son had carried that lesson all the way to the end, and it had cost him everything. James found me still sitting there past midnight, the journal open on my knee, and he didn't say anything comforting because there wasn't anything comforting to say. He just refilled my coffee and sat down across from me. "Now we know what happened," he said quietly. "Question is what we do about the woman who ordered it." I closed the journal. My hands, for the first time since the funeral, were completely steady. "We finish what he started," I said carefully, "and we don't stop until she's the one standing in a courtroom instead of a cemetery." Part 5. The Trap. I have spent a career learning one particular truth about dangerous people. The moment they believe they've won, they stop being careful. Rebecca believed she'd won the day the locks changed on that house. She believed a 74-year-old widower with a used SUV and a folded flag was no threat to anyone. That belief, I decided, was the single most useful weapon James and I had. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done in a war that had nothing to do with any battlefield I'd known before. I went home to the small apartment I'd rented near the VA clinic since being pushed out of Michael's house, and I called Rebecca myself, my voice deliberately worn thin, deliberately defeated. "I don't want any trouble," I told her. "I just want to grieve my son in peace. I'm an old man, Rebecca. I don't have the fight left in me that you seem to think I do." There was a pause on the line, and then something in her voice loosened, softened with the particular relief of a predator, realizing the last obstacle in her path had simply lain down. "I'm glad you understand, Daniel," she said. "This doesn't have to be difficult." It nearly broke something in me to let her believe that. Every instinct I'd built over 3 decades screamed against showing weakness to an enemy. But James had taught me all those years ago on our second tour that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier does is let the enemy believe they've already won. Behind the scenes, James had been busy. His old contacts in the Boston PD, combined with what we'd handed over from Michael's hard drive, had been enough to get the FBI's Financial Crimes Division involved, quietly, carefully, the way these things have to move when the person under investigation has money lawyers, and we now suspected at least one compromised contact somewhere close to the case. An agent named Diane Whitfield took the lead, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who reminded me a little of my late wife in the way she asked exactly the right questions and wasted no words doing it. "We have enough to open a case," she told James and me in a windowless conference room downtown, "but not enough to convict. Rebecca and her associates have covered their tracks well on paper. We need her to say something on record that we can use. Something that isn't just a recording her lawyer can claim was doctored or taken out of context." That's where the SUV came back into the story. It turned out Rebecca still wanted it, not out of sentiment, Agent Whitfield explained, but because her associates had grown nervous. If Michael had suspected the brakes were sabotaged, if he documented anything about that vehicle before he died, they needed it gone, or at minimum needed to know what evidence might still be sitting inside it. Rebecca began calling me, her voice syrupy with false concern, asking whether I'd consider trading the SUV for a nicer, newer car, something more practical for a man your age. I recognized the maneuver for exactly what it was. Agent Whitfield's team fitted the SUV with recording equipment so discreet even I couldn't find it once installed. Then we set the trap. I told Rebecca I'd meet her, that I was tired of driving Michael's old rust bucket and would consider the trade, but that I wanted to do it somewhere private, somewhere I wouldn't have to see the house that used to belong to my son. She agreed, suspiciously eager, and suggested a parking garage downtown, the same garage I'd learn later, where that black SUV had waited for Michael on 11 separate nights. I sat behind the wheel of Michael's car in that garage on a gray Tuesday evening, my heart doing something I hadn't felt since my last deployment, waiting. Rebecca arrived first alone, but not for long. Victor Reyes appeared minutes later, stepping out of the shadows, the way men do when they've spent a lifetime believing shadows belong to them. The lawyer came next, the same soft-spoken man from Pete's recordings, his voice as smooth in person as it had been on video. They believed they were speaking to a grieving old man who'd handed them the keys and stepped back to let them search the car for whatever evidence still worried them. What they didn't know was that James Agent Whitfield and 2 federal agents were parked less than 100 yards away, listening to every word through the equipment hidden in that vehicle's frame. Rebecca, believing herself finally safe, began to talk. She spoke about the insurance payout, about how clean everything had turned out once Michael was gone. She thanked Reyes for handling the car situation, and when the lawyer asked carefully whether there was any risk the father might figure things out, Rebecca laughed an ugly, careless sound I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life, and said, "Daniel Collins doesn't have it in him anymore. He's just an old soldier waiting to die." I sat 2 floors above them in James's car, listening through an earpiece, my jaw clenched so hard it ached for days afterward. I wanted more than I have wanted, almost anything, to walk down those concrete stairs and face her myself. James's hand on my shoulder was the only thing that kept me in that seat. "Let her finish digging," he said quietly. "She's doing our job for us." She did. Over the next 20 minutes, between the 3 of them, Rebecca and her associates said enough about the brake tampering, about the insurance fraud, about a broker who arranged the sabotage through a third party neither of them would name outright, but described in enough detail for Agent Whitfield's team to already have a face in mind to fill an indictment several times over. When the agents finally moved in, weapons drawn, badges raised, the look on Rebecca's face was not fear at first. It was disbelief, the particular disbelief of someone who has spent her whole life believing herself smarter than everyone around her, watching that belief collapse in real time. She looked up past the agents and found me standing at the top of the garage stairs, exactly where James had told me to wait. And for once, I had actually listened. "You," she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, I heard something other than contempt in her voice. I heard fear. "My son taught me patience." I told her, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect. I just had to remember how to use it. The arrest in that parking garage was only the beginning. What followed was months of a slower, quieter kind of war, the kind fought in conference rooms and courtrooms, instead of on any battlefield I'd ever trained for, but a war all the same, and one I was determined to see through to its final battle. Victor Reyes broke first, as men like him usually do. Facing federal racketeering charges staring down the barrel of decades in prison, he traded what he knew for a plea deal that would still leave him behind bars, just not for the rest of his natural life. What he gave the prosecutors was worse than anything I had imagined, and I had by then imagined quite a lot. The scheme, it turned out, ran deeper than one greedy widow and her ambitious accomplices. Michael, in his work at the hospital, had stumbled onto financial irregularities in a charitable medical fund, one that solicited donations for underprivileged patients, ostensibly to cover surgeries and treatments families couldn't afford. Over several years, a portion of those donations had been quietly siphoned off, laundered through shell companies Reyes controlled, and redistributed among a small circle that included, we learned with a sickness that settled deep in my stomach, Rebecca herself, who had been introduced to Reyes through a hospital fundraising gala nearly 3 years earlier. Michael had found discrepancies in the fund's records almost by accident, cross-referencing patient files during a routine audit request from the hospital board. He'd begun asking questions quietly the way a careful man does when he isn't yet sure who he can trust with an accusation this serious. Those questions had reached the wrong ears. And once Rebecca learned her own husband was closing in on a scheme that could unravel not just Reyes's operation, but her own quiet involvement in it, she'd made a choice. No grief, no explanation, no plea deal could ever soften in my eyes. She hadn't married my son and then discovered greed along the way. She had Reyes's testimony revealed married him, already entangled with these people, already skimming, already comfortable, moving in circles where human lives were simply variables in someone else's spreadsheet. Michael's death wasn't a marriage gone wrong. It was from very early on a transaction she had always been prepared to make if the moment required it. I sat in that courtroom every single day of the trial in the same seat, third row aisle side, the seat close enough to Rebecca's table that she could not avoid seeing me each time she turned. I did not look away. 30 years of service teaches a man to hold a position under fire, and I held mine. Emily testified about Michael's fear in those final months, her voice breaking only once when she described the promise he'd extracted from her trust. My father, whatever anybody says. James testified about the investigation measured and precise, every word chosen the way a good detective chooses words built to survive cross-examination without cracking. Agent Whitfield walked the jury through months of financial records with the patience of someone who had clearly done this 100 times before and never once let it feel routine. And then it was my turn. I hadn't planned to give a long testimony. I am not by nature a man who enjoys the sound of his own voice in a room full of strangers. But sitting in that witness chair looking out at 12 people who would decide what justice looked like for my son, something in me needed them to understand who Michael actually was, not just a name on an indictment, not just a victim in a fraud case, but a boy who once sat on a dock with his feet in a lake, worried a loon's cry meant it was crying, who grew into a man who spent his life putting broken people back together, who was afraid for months and never once stopped protecting the people he loved, even while he was dying by inches inside that fear. I told them about the recording in the car, about the box under the dock, about a father who had failed to notice his own son drowning until it was too late to save him, and who had spent every day since trying to at least make sure the world knew the truth of what happened. When I stepped down from that chair, I looked at Rebecca one final time. She did not meet my eyes. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. When they returned, the verdict came down exactly as the evidence demanded: guilty on all counts, conspiracy, fraud, and most gravely guilty in the murder of my son, tried under a theory of depraved indifference that the prosecutor had built with a precision I will be grateful for until the day I die. Reyes and the lawyer received their own sentences in the weeks that followed. The broker was identified and arrested 3 states away, trying to disappear into a life built on someone else's stolen identity. Outside the courthouse, James stood beside me on the steps, the autumn light doing that same gold thing it had done the evening I first sat behind the wheel of Michael's car. He didn't say anything triumphant. He never has been that kind of man. He just put a hand on my shoulder the way he had in that garage, the way old soldiers do when words feel too small for the moment. He'd be proud of you, James said finally. I thought about my son on that dock as a boy, and my son as a grown man writing a letter he hoped I'd never have to read, and I thought about the particular terrible privilege of having lived long enough to finish what he started. He's the one who did the hard part, I said. I just followed the map he left me. We stood there a long while, 2 old men on courthouse steps watching the city move on around us the way cities do, indifferent to the weight of what had just been settled inside those walls. Somewhere out there, my grandson Noah was waiting for me, 10 years old, and still too young to fully understand what his father had died protecting, or what his grandfather had done to make sure the truth outlived the lie. I had a promise to keep to that boy now, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief settle into my chest. I felt ready to go home. The trial had been over for 2 weeks when I finally drove that SUV back out to the cemetery on my own. No James beside me this time, no case left to build, no evidence left to gather. Just an old man and the car his son had left him, and a conversation I owed to a grave I hadn't visited alone since the day we buried him. The leaves had turned since that first drive back when the locks changed and the dashboard lit up and a dead man's voice told me to follow a road I didn't understand yet. Now the trees along the cemetery drive burned orange and red, and the air had that clean cold bite that always used to mean Michael would be calling soon to remind me to get my flu shot, a habit of his mother's he'd inherited and never let me forget. I parked near his headstone and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel the way I had that very first evening. Then I reached over and found the recording again, the one that had started all of this, still saved on that dashboard where it had been waiting for me all along. I pressed play and let his voice fill the car one more time. "Dad, if you're hearing this, follow the GPS. Don't tell Rebecca." I had heard it perhaps 200 times by then during the investigation, during the trial, during long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and I needed to hear my son's voice more than I needed rest. It never stopped hurting. But that day, sitting in the cemetery with the case finally closed, it hurt differently, less like a wound freshly opened, more like the ache of a scar that had finally mercifully begun to heal. I got out and walked to his headstone, my knees complaining the way they always did on cold mornings, and I knelt down in the grass beside it. I had brought something with me that I'd been carrying since my discharge from the Army 30 years ago and had never once in all that time considered giving away. My service medal, the one I earned the hard way, the one that had sat in a drawer through 2 wars and a marriage, and the raising of a son who grew up to be braver than I ever gave him credit for while he was alive. I set it down on the stone. "You did the hard part, son," I said, and this time, finally, 30 years of locked doors inside me came open all at once. And I let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry at the funeral, the way I probably should have let myself cry a long time before that. "I just followed the map you left me. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were trying to tell me. I stayed there a good while, long enough for the cold to work its way properly into my joints, long enough to say everything I'd needed to say to a man who could no longer answer, but who I believed somewhere was listening. In the months that followed, I built something out of the wreckage Rebecca and her associates had left behind. With Linda Hayes' help, and using what remained of my own modest savings, along with a portion of assets eventually recovered through the fraud investigation, I established a scholarship in Michael's name, the Michael Collins Memorial Fund, dedicated to medical students who commit in writing to a minimum of 5 years serving underinsured communities after graduation. The same kind of patience Michael had spent his whole career quietly fighting for long before I understood the true cost of that fight. I donated the SUV to a nonprofit that provides transportation for disabled veterans getting to and from medical appointments. It felt right. That car had carried my son's secrets for months, had carried me through the darkest investigation of my life, and it seemed only fitting that its final chapter would be spent carrying other soldiers home. The way it had, in its own strange way, carried me home to the truth. Noah is 17 now, tall in the way boys get right before they stop being boys entirely, and just last spring he told me with a seriousness that reminded me so much of his father, it nearly stopped my heart, that he intends to become a military surgeon. He wants to serve. He told me the way his father served people in that hospital and the way I served in uniform, and he wants to do it in his father's name. I keep a photograph on my mantle, now 3 generations deep, myself in dress uniform, Michael in his white coat, and Noah in the football jersey he was wearing the day the picture was taken, before any of us knew what the coming years would ask of this family. I look at it most mornings with my coffee, and some mornings it still aches, the particular ache of loving people you've lost, and people you're still watching grow all in the same breath. But it doesn't ache the way it used to. Grief, I've learned at 74, doesn't disappear. It just eventually makes room for something else to sit beside it, pride mostly, and a strange, hard-won kind of peace. Honor isn't something you inherit. I told Noah once not long ago when he asked me what I'd learned from everything that happened to his father. It's something you leave behind. I believe that more than I've believed almost anything in my long life. My son left me a car, a letter, and a roadmap to the truth. What he really left me, though, was a reminder that love doesn't stop working just because a life ends, that sometimes it keeps protecting the people you love long after you're gone if you're willing to follow where it leads. I don't know where your own road has taken you or what truths you're still searching for in your own life, but I hope wherever you are tonight that you have someone who loves you enough to leave you a map when you need one most, and I hope you have the courage to follow it wherever it leads. I want to know where this story finds you. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you every day, so please subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.